This Namrata's face is invisible. Yes. Give me a signal and we're ready to roll. Morning, President Ravi Nedungadi. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Ravi.
Good morning. Morning, Ram. Ram Chandran is our treasurer of the Rotary Cantonment. Let me broadly see how I can introduce my members and you can introduce yours till the time we warm up to the meeting per se. If you each of you want to introduce yourself, please go ahead. Next, we have another two, 3 minutes to warm up so that we have more people on the. We have 39 logged in. The moment we touch 50, we should start. Morning, Indu. Sorry, come into the gallery view to say hello to you. Morning, Sushila. All of you are looking good. Ravi, would you like to introduce any of the people in your gallery view?
We have Palani Loganathan, our Honorary Secretary.
Wonderful.
Palani, if you raise your hand. Quresh Merchant is our Chairman for Fellowship. We have Seema Sibal, who is our Director for Teach.
Oh.
And of course, Namrata. I'm seeing a few co-presidents. Dwarka, hi. From Orchards.
I think we should start now.
We are 43 at the moment. $44. Ravi, it's 5 past. You want to kick off? Ravi?
So please unmute yourself.
Yeah, now I could do that. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ravi.
Yeah.
Why not kick off? It's about 5-6 minutes past.
Yeah. Thank you. So welcome to the this Break the Silence meeting. Break the Silence, Stop the Violence is the. This is Ravi Narsaman, President of the Rotary Bangalore Cantonment. I bring greetings to everyone here from my club, and let me take the opportunity to say hello to President Ravi Nedungadi, who is also a co-host and a co-president from Rotary Midtown, which is hosting this, jointly hosting the program. I'm happy that 55 people have already logged in at this moment for this show. I think we expect the program to be an interesting one. From our side, we have Avni Bansal, Unnati Machar. Avni Bansal is going to be the speaker. Unnati Machar and Indu Sridhar will be the co-panelists. And we have Sushila Venkatraman, who's going to be the person who's going to moderate the program. So we have a wonderful gathering already. I think we should, without wasting any time on, I think even the objectives which I was originally supposed to talk about is better done by Avni, so that we make sure that you get a proper gist of the program. So, so let me hand over the coordinates to Sushila, so that she can take over the moderation straight away, and then introduce the speakers, and then start the meeting. So may the meeting begin. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nisha Goenka, and I would be introducing the panelists. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Sridhar Project is an initiative started a couple of years ago by the 6 of us wanting to give back to society. We volunteer our time, efforts, and resources to raise funds and create awareness for various causes. Sridhar Project has successfully done events to raise funds for big and small NGOs alike, including Akshay Patra's Nelamangla and Puducherry Kitchens, Cuddles Foundation, and many more. With the COVID pandemic escalating and people still confined to their homes, there has been a sharp rise of domestic violence cases. To spread awareness, talk about the challenges faced by the victims and their rights, we curated this webinar in association with Rotary Midtown Bangalore and Rotary Club of Bangalore Cantonment. We have some extremely accomplished women here with us today. Our first panelist is Avani Bansal. She is a Supreme Court advocate, an alumni of HNLU, University of Oxford, and Harvard Law School. She runs Hamara Kanun, a legal awareness project that explains important laws in Hindi in a simple way in a video format. Avani is passionate about access to justice, gender rights, and has traveled extensively delivering lectures and even written a book titled Life at Law School. Our next panelist, Indu Sridhar, was an educator for 25 plus years. Her passion for reaching out to those emotionally affected by any kind of trauma led her to qualify as a counselor, and in 2004, she co-founded the Sneha Society for Counseling in Bangalore. Our third panelist has a degree in counseling psychology and over 13 years of experience in the field of public health. Unnati Machar is Associate Program Director, Prevention of Violence Against Women and Children at Sneha, Mumbai. She oversees research trials in the program where they are testing the effects of community mobilization on prevention of violence against women and girls in urban informal settlements. Our panelists could be in no better hands than today's moderator, the highly qualified Dr. Sushila Venkatraman. Currently, the chair of Arogya World India Trust, Dr. Venkatraman, has a PhD from BITS and 2 master's degrees from the University of Delhi and IIT. Over to you, Dr. Venkatraman.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks to our panelists for being here. We have a fairly, it's a large issue. It's obviously a very pressing one. So I would like to start by congratulating the Sridhar project on picking this issue up and bringing it to the fore. Let me start immediately and without any further discussion. Let me start with Indu. And Indu, could you help us with a definition of domestic violence? It is both physical and otherwise. So could you tell us a little bit about what it is and what are the signs? How does someone recognize that they are in a situation of domestic violence?
Thank you, Sushila, and thank you to Rotary Midtown and Rotary Club of Cantonment for having me here as a panelist. Yes, domestic violence is presently a very, very pressing issue. And it is wonderful that Sridhar Projects has brought this up. Now, the definition of domestic violence, it is basically a pattern of assaultive and very coercive behaviors. It's a conduct perpetrated by adults or adolescents against their intimate partners. And this relationship context is very important to understand to develop any kind of effective interventions. The perpetrators have an ongoing access to their victims. And that is how domestic violence has become very rampant in these confined times, in these COVID times. They know their daily routines, they know their vulnerabilities, and are able to have access to this. And that's how they target their assaults. Another very, very important factor in knowing about domestic violence is that it's a pattern of behaviors. It's not an isolated incident by any chance. It's a repeated incident and on a regular basis, and could have daily episodes also. It's a little difficult to say how you would recognize a perpetrator. Basically, because it can be a he can be very subtle. I'm using the word he in this context because mostly the victims are women. The percentage of victims are women, higher percentage. I would possibly put it this way, that there are certain characteristics that a perpetrator has, which are recognizable, but it doesn't mean that anyone with such characteristics would be a perpetrator. Very often a perpetrator, see, the whole thing is all about power dynamics. And most often the perpetrator has very poor social skills, has a very poor, a very low self-esteem, and indulges in self-devaluation. He has very strained relationships with adults and is quite a lonely person. He may also have a lot of sexual problems. I hope that answers your question, Sushila.
Thank you, Indu. Thank you. Unnati, you've been researching this whole area. So something that Indu mentioned, which is that, here we are talking mostly about women because that's the largest percentage. But can you quickly just touch on men or children or someone else as victims of domestic violence? And also, could you talk a little bit about the trend in terms of numbers, in terms of social categories and so on? Just briefly. Are you unmuted?
Yes, I am unmuted just now. So first we will talk about the trends. With regards to increase in domestic violence by mid-March 2020, there were reports from different countries like Australia, Brazil, China, United States, that the number of cases are increasing. In India, the National Commission for Women, which receives complaints from across the country, has recorded more than twofold rise in gender-based violence cases. The total complaints rose, like from women, it rose from 116 in first week of March to 257 in the final week. Complaints of rape or attempted to rape rose sharply from 2 to 13. There has been almost threefold increase in police non-response to women's complaints. Police were citing reasons that they are busy enforcing the COVID lockdown, and which is why they were not able to help women. In Sneha Counseling Center, what we register is about 400 cases a month. That comes to about 4,800 cases in a year. But during COVID, the women's mobility has been restricted. They are not able to report the cases. Like in March 2020, we had our counseling centers reporting 513 cases, out of which 177 survivors, that is 37%, were provided initial support, psychoeducation, and counseling on the helpline number. In a normal situation, what would happen is we would receive about 100 calls on the helpline and 10 crisis emails. But during the pandemic, what happened is from mid-March to around April, we received 45. So 10 to 45 is a huge number and a huge rise in the number of emails. And 32 out of which were from Mumbai and 13 from elsewhere in India. Survivors have requested help, that they are facing violence. It is not only physical, it includes emotional, it includes verbal, sexual violence. And it is not only restricted to marital homes. It is also, they were facing violence from natal homes as well. And what we observed is that our calls on helpline started declining. The reason of it is that women were in a small space, living in smaller spaces. Their perpetrators are all around. The family members who are abusing them are all around, and which is why they are not able to call us. And that's the reason we started receiving more emails. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This may be a good time to switch to asking about the legal provisions that are available. Avani, tell us what are the laws against it in India? And also, could you then say how effective they are and what is the situation?
Thanks very much, Sushila, and thanks to Rotary for the very kind invite. Sushila, some important points. See, the Indian Penal Code, which is the criminal law in India, always had provisions for any kind of physical or mental harassment caused against women. But in 2005, we brought in a special law, which is called the Domestic Violence Act 2005. This is a comprehensive law to deal with all kinds of domestic violence. The thing to be noted is that under this act, number one, the definition of domestic violence has been enlarged significantly, such that not just a single slap, but even if a husband or a partner, when two people are living in a marriage-like relationship, so even live-in relationships are covered. If the woman is deprived of basic economic sustenance to run the house, or if she's taken away or kept away from her children, or if she's said certain words which can lead to constituting emotional trauma. So physical, emotional, sexual, and economic, all these kinds of violences are covered as domestic violence. Now, Domestic Violence Act, the beauty of it is also that earlier under the Indian Penal Code, it would take cases forever to go on to be heard and for an effective order to be given in favor of the party. In the Domestic Violence Act, protection officers have been appointed by the government at every district level. So even if a woman who thinks, I don't know anybody, I don't know where to go, what to do, all she needs to do is reach out to the local protection officer who will help her approach the magistrate concerned. And if the situation is dire, the magistrate can, on the very first day of hearing, even without listening to the opposite party, grant an order in favor of the woman. This order can be in form of compensation, that she should be given some form of compensation on day one. It can be a residence order, means that she cannot be pushed away from her matrimonial house if that's what's happening, that she should be given the custody of her children if that is her concern, or that the husband or the partner in concern should not have access to the woman till the next hearing. So, very wide gamut of orders that can be given in favor of women. And this is, in a large way, it also is an upgrade from, for example, the Dowry Prohibition Act or the relevant dowry laws in the Indian Penal Code. It is also used in addition a lot of times to Section 125A of CRPC, which is used for maintenance. So, Domestic Violence Act has now become the go-to provision for any kind of violence by any female member against anybody. Initially, when the act came, it said only male members could be tried. But now, even if the mother-in-law is creating a problem, or the daughter, or let's say the husband's sister, or anybody in the family is creating any kind of a violent situation, the woman has the right to go to the protection officer and try and get an order on the very first date itself. So, to that extent, it is very effective. Well, of course, there is always a difference in India between theory and practice. So, sometimes, especially during the lockdown, there has been a challenge in terms of effective use of these laws in terms of going to the courts, because a lot of courts are not holding any hearings at all. And so there is a big question mark in terms of effectiveness of these laws during the lockdown time.
Okay. But apart from that, the law itself is pretty robust and it has evolved over time, is really what you've said. So maybe we will, one of the questions that is coming up is, can you describe what a protection officer is and so on? So why don't we kind of take some of these detailed questions for a little later in the talk, but our audience can continue to send in questions so that we can build them in as we go through the discussion today. One of the things that you mentioned earlier is that there is a little difficulty for women to reach out to either counselors or the legal system or whatever. So Indu, quite apart from the fact that right now, because of the lockdown and the domestic situation, women are unable to reach out. But I remember you're mentioning at some point of time that even in good times, I mean, if you think of the non-COVID times as good times, then even during that time, you were mentioning that women are very hesitant to actually reach out and talk about the fact that they are in an abusive relationship. So can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, Sushila. You must remember let's underline one point of in this discussion. Abuse thrives in silence. And women are very, very afraid to move out of their zones and reach out for help. In the first place, they may not even recognize that they are being abused. If it is not physical abuse, suppose it is economic in nature, they may not even realize, they may think it is the right of the male to handle the finances in the house. They may not even recognize it. That's a very major problem. The perpetrator may also look very caring and gentle, But what happens is that very often in this process, they start isolating the victim. And gradually, the perpetrator isolates the victim from family and friends till such a time that the victim herself starts withdrawing from all her near and dear ones. Very often, the victim also starts thinking, maybe I'm at fault. Maybe I should have been more careful and responded correctly to whatever his demands were. So this starts hampering her effort in reaching out. Very importantly, her self-esteem is battered to such an extent that reaching out is almost an impossible task, and self-blame becomes a very useful tool to hide behind. In addition, the social stigma that attached to domestic violence makes them cringe from revealing anything. It is swept under the carpet, saying that it is just within the family and I don't want to talk about it. They are very, women are very, they've lost their esteem to such an extent that they suffer from a great deal of shame and embarrassment and are afraid of being judged by society. They're afraid of being judged by the counselor, and they're unsure of how a counselor may react to their revelations. So it is extremely difficult for them to come out without some kind of help.
Thank you. Avni, earlier when we talked, you were saying that the kind of support that you provide to the victim of domestic violence is not just legal, but a whole lot of other things as well, such as taking them and helping them with other, say, putting them onto other not-for-profits and NGOs who do other kinds of interventions or provide other kinds of support. So can you touch a little bit on that? And the second thing that I would like you to talk about now is, as Indu says, that they are, what they find in the counseling world is this hesitation on the part of women to talk about what's happening. But as a legal profession, how do you find, and what are the kinds of stories that you have encountered with respect to victims who come forward?
Thank you, Sushila ji. The first thing is that I have noticed that when women come to me as a lawyer for domestic violence cases, very often they're not entirely confident of going the legal route, because they think that once they start the legal procedure, that will for all purposes mean the breakdown of marriage. So a lot of women don't report, what they consider minor violence cases. So if somebody, let's say a husband or a partner has beaten them up, they would think, and this is the first time happening in the relationship, the people around them are likely to say, "पहली बार ही तो हो रहा है, ये तो सारी शादियों में होता है. What is the big deal? और तुम इतनी जल्दी एक बार में कोर्ट कैसे जा सकती हो? How can you go to courts or go to lawyers the very first time this incident has happened?" So what I've seen is sometimes women will suffer in silence for years at end before finally making up their mind that enough is enough and now I need to go to the courts. But what they don't realize in the process is that significantly weakens their case, because when the matter comes up before the judge and the woman says, "Well, I have been suffering in silence for many years," if the woman is educated, and she's coming from a relatively strong financial background, she has a family support. Sometimes the judges think, is this a false case? Is this a true case? Why did the woman never ever report the case, right? Of course, if you have some evidence in your favor, it will work in your favor. But the point I'm trying to make is that even educated women, continue to be patient for many years at end before they realize that now my threshold has kind of come to a peak. So it's very important that women report these matters as and when they happen, and as we say in the legal world, nip it in the bud. Because if a person has slapped you, has caused some kind of violence against you, pattern shows that it is likely to happen again. Number one. Number two, Sushilaji, there are a lot of questions coming on protection officers. Let me just say that protection officers are primarily meant for women, who don't know where to go. So, mostly women in rural areas who have absolutely no idea. The protection officers help them fill up what we call a domestic incident report and help them approach the court. For everybody who's listening here, who's fairly, who understands English, can do a normal Google search, will know that all you got to do is you got to find out the local magistrate in your district court, and you just need to file a case very simply drafted as soon as possible. There are several local lawyers, there are lawyers otherwise who will be willing to help you for that. So you don't have to necessarily worry about going through a protection officer. That's very important. So when women come to us, the first thing I try to tell them is that you need to make up your mind what is it that you want. Sometimes when you go the legal route, yes, there is a possibility that the family side, the husband's family side, may react very aggressively, and it can go down the drain in the sense that it can have effects on your married life, so to say. But then you have to make up your mind. What I find is, for women to pass that psychological barrier and decide within themselves that are they willing to put up that violence or are they not. But the thought that because I have seen a lot of women who think that after I get pregnant, funnily enough, my husband will change, things will change. And again, there are documented reports and studies which suggest that nothing of that sort happens. Induji pointed out that men who are perpetrators of domestic violence have low self-esteem. I can't tell you how many cases I've seen where the perpetrators are judges, they're IAS officers, they're otherwise doing very well in society, in life. So where is this root of domestic violence coming from in their head? What is it that they've seen growing up? What is their understanding of power dynamics between men and women? In my understanding, is not only defined by their social status or their educational status. So if you think that there is violence around you, take a step and take it at the earliest opportunity. That would be what I would want to share, Sushilaji, at this point.
Great, thanks. And are you also seeing this hesitation that women have to really share with you very openly about everything that they are going through or have gone through? Or are they, once they've kind of taken that step, they are a lot more forthcoming and honest?
No, once they come to a lawyer, Sushilaji, in my experience, women then just really open up. In fact, sometimes they open up in a way that you feel, they're not talking to a lawyer, they're talking to a friend, because they know that with a lawyer, at least there is going to be no judgment. So whatever it is that the partner or the husband is doing, women really open up. And I think there is an understanding that, you can't hide anything from your lawyer or from your doctor. You should not. So I think once women decide that, I have to speak to a lawyer, they really open up, which is very important. But it takes us 2 or 3 hearings to kind of calm them down and to then tell them that, what are things that they cannot worry about legally, and what are the things that they can worry about legally. So where is the legal case in all the trauma they have suffered? Just because the husband is not taking you out for a vacation every time you want, or is not helping you shop what you want, that's not a cause for concern. So sure. It's like, pulling out the shaft from the grain and telling them here there is a legal case. I think that process takes a few rounds.
Right. You brought up something very, you made a statement which is, I think, very significant, which is about going into the mind of the perpetrator. Maybe, Unnati, if you could come in at this stage and tell us a little bit about, what, well, is it possible for a perpetrator to change his ways at all? Since you're really looking at prevention, which I think is fabulous, rather than doing something about it after it's happened, you're really going further and saying, can we prevent it? And so, do you think it's possible for a perpetrator to change his ways?
So, perpetrator to change his ways, what we do is, what we offer is, initially we in our counseling centers, we hear a woman out and slowly build her confidence. Once that is done, after 2 or 3 sessions, we also call in the perpetrator, her partner, for a joint counseling session. So there are certain counseling sessions with the partner as well as with the family, so that they are able to understand that a woman is being violated, and which is why there has been some changes. Yeah, the violence reduces to some extent, and the violence reduces to some extent, and then they learn. We also have another program called Batterers Program, wherein we bring these perpetrators together and we conduct sessions for them. It is not mandatory in our country as yet, but we are doing this program separately, where they come in, they understand about the patriarchy, the way they have been brought up, the society, the expectations of their roles from the society, and how they are supposed to behave like a man. And slowly they realize that difference in that gender roles, and then we try to bridge that gap. So yes, it requires efforts and time, but there we do find some changes in the perpetrators over the period. Yeah.
Oh, that's really good to know that it's not a lost cause. So I'm very happy to kind of have you say that here. Indu, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the impact. We started by saying this is a very important issue. Maybe if you could tell us a little, maybe share a story or two about the kind of impact that domestic violence has on the family, particularly children, the parents, the siblings of a victim. You need to unmute yourself. Indu, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the impact is very, very devastating, especially on the children. More than the family, I would like to concentrate on the children, because they are the ones who are directly affected by domestic violence. The children grow up in a very strained atmosphere in the house. They're confused as to what is happening, and they may develop all kinds of issues. Of course, self-esteem is badly hit. They have eating and sleeping disorders, which are very noticeable. Then there's physical issues, like you see them finger biting, shaking, stuttering, and so on and so forth. Mood-related disorders, depression, emotional neediness, a kind of clinginess. Children cling to their mothers way beyond the age of 3 or 4 or whatever it is. It can go on for quite some years. And that's a sure sign of the fact that they are insecure. And insecurity can be very devastating. They withdraw. They withdraw from friends. They withdraw from their classmates. You see a whole lot of school issues. There's a lot of aggression and rage, unnecessary aggression and rage. You don't really know why they are so aggressive. Again, absolutely on the other side of the scale, you have detachment and avoidance. They avoid people. They don't like to. Children should be ready to play with others, but very often they avoid kids of their age. And a little later, when they are more aware, suicidal ideation starts coming in. And that can remain with them for life. All these are issues that can remain with them for life, and that is where the danger is. So it needs to be addressed at a very early stage.
Right. And it also means that even if a woman doesn't kind of acknowledge or recognize that she's in an abusive relationship, by just seeing the children and the impact it has on them, it is time that she took action, is really what you're saying.
Yes. In fact, I could possibly share a case with you. I had a lady who came in with me, fairly middle-aged lady who came into Sneha. and I counseled her through a long period. She came in because she was very concerned that her 29-year-old daughter was not willing to get married, wasn't even giving it a thought. And that in a traditional household is not very acceptable. And she was very concerned about it. But hardly did she talk about this, that she started justifying the fact that her daughter is refusing to get married. And this really got me flummoxed. I said, here she comes to talk about a 29-year-old girl not wanting to get married. And she starts justifying it. And then, of course, she had a breakdown and went into the description of her own marriage, which had every kind of domestic violence, physical, sexual, psychological, and economic. She came to me for over a year before she could really build up some degree of self-esteem and confidence. I would say some degree. And, you know, she was in a permanent government job, fairly well paid, but her finances were totally controlled by her husband. One day, in fact, she came to me in such a state and she says, Indu, I don't have money to pay for the gas. What do I do? She was desperate. And from then on, I thought, okay, let me start working on the fact that she is a working person and let me help her work out her essential needs, how to plan for her essential needs. And we started working on that. And that's when the big shift started happening. Gradually, she moved on. And I will leave the story at this. She has healed to a certain extent where she can stand up to her husband in some ways. But the more important thing is that the daughter saw a change in her and the change in family atmosphere and came to seek for help herself. And that's a totally different story.
Right. Thank you. Avni, maybe we will now switch and come back to you. What are the legal provisions in the sense, you know, and how does someone take recourse to the legal provisions that are available? And, you know, if let us say there is a case of domestic violence happening somewhere, can a friend or someone in the community also do something about it? Or does that woman herself have to step up? Is that the only way to do it?
Yes, Sushila ji, that's a very important question. I will answer it in 2 or 3 different things and also take up some of the points which people have asked in the chat box. So to begin with your question, yes, you know, we don't have to be bystanders. So let's say if a friend of ours, if somebody in the family that we know is suffering, you know, uh, uh, suffering from domestic violence in one form or the other, we have the right to directly approach the local protection officer and notify that such and such case is happening. The protection officer then, in most cases, in all likelihood, will approach you know, the aggrieved woman in question, and with her permission, then, you know, try and help her file the legal proceedings, etc. The beauty of the Domestic Violence Act is that it has a special section, Section 4, which says that any informant, any person, you can even be an unrelated person, who notifies to the protection officer that such and such case is happening, is protected in all ways. So there cannot be any case against the informant, you know, through the perpetrator of the crime at any point, or even by the aggrieved person for that matter. So we don't have to be bystanders. If you think that there is domestic violence going on around you, please take cognizance of it and report it either to the local protection officer, or for that matter, even the police officer in charge of the nearby police station where this is taking place. One quick point which did not specifically come up, but a lot of people have questions all the time, is where can I file my case? Which police station do I go to? And which court can I go to? For police stations, it's a fairly simple point in law, but a lot of people are not aware of it. Is that, let's say you're not sure which is the right police station. You go to a police station and you make out a case. Even if that is not the police station which has jurisdiction in your case, they have to register what we call a zero FIR. Means they will register an FIR, and it is the police officers or the police station's responsibility to then transfer that FIR to the concerned or the right, police station which has the power to investigate your case. As far as which court is concerned, which is in which city can you approach the local magistrate? So wherever the aggrieved woman is staying, either permanently or temporarily, or where the perpetrator of the crime is staying temporarily or permanently, or where the cause of action took place. Let's say the two of you went for a holiday and it was a long holiday and some incident happened there. Even the local magistrate of that particular city will have jurisdiction in your case. Now, very quickly, one point that's been raised, in the chat box by Shruti and Rashi about financial independence or financial dependence of women and how that acts as a hurdle. You would be surprised to know that all women in India are qualified for legal aid, irrespective of your economic background. I'm just going to share a link as I speak. Under the Legal Services Authorities Act, all women and children in India are qualified for legal aid. It is an irony that, in spite of this, huge legal provision and government spending crores of money, people are not aware of this provision. So no woman can say that because I don't have the financial means, I cannot, go to the court. Of course, I understand it's easier said than done, because even if your legal fees are paid for by the Legal Services Authority, I've just shared a link where you can find the entire procedure. There is the question of what will I do once I leave the matrimonial house. And most of us here in this room today, the audience is, my understanding is of a certain kind. I will say that, I have seen, I'm a Bansal, I come from a Baniya family. This is not to point out caste. This is to point out that around me, I've seen, women coming from very solid economic backgrounds, very well read, but for one reason or the other, they wouldn't continue their job or their service after their marriage. And when things go sour, these women sometimes find it harder to come out of it and report their violence than what you would imagine a ruler woman, with almost hand to mouth and nothing to eat and three children to feed. She will have more guts because she thinks, listen, I cannot do this. I will swipe floors, wash utensils, do whatever, but I'm not going to live under this. So it's very important for women, as Virginia Woolf would say, to have a room of one's own, irrespective of what economic backgrounds we're coming from. Because I'll just take 30 more seconds, Sushila ji. I mean, lockdown is a completely different story. But even during general times, the figures in India are horrendous. National Crime Records Bureau tells us that every 3 minutes, there is one or the other form of violence against women. That's the number we are talking about. So whoever we are, we think it won't happen to me. ये मेरे साथ नहीं हो सकता. Or if it happens to us, we think मैंने ऐसे क्या गलती करी थी कि ये मेरे साथ हुआ. So it's very important to tell women not to blame themselves, and financially dependent or not, one has to figure out a way of earning one's livelihood and not take violence, as an excuse for anything. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks. What are some do's and don'ts? You mentioned at the beginning that a woman should step in and talk about it as early as possible. So that's one do. Are there any other do's and don'ts that you would recommend?
Yes, Sushila ji, there are several, but I'll just point out a few which, to my mind and in my experience, are the most important ones. Right. First thing I will say is that now, as per a recent Supreme Court judgment, women can file a domestic violence case even against the female members of the household, which means against your mother-in-law, as I was saying, or against the sister of your husband, etc., etc. But just because you have this right, a lot of times lawyers, and I take responsibility and say this, wrongfully, advise women to name everybody in the domestic incident report, right? Please don't do that. Because, there is already a criticism of why Domestic Violence Act protects only women and not men. While, of course, the number of cases against women in terms of violence perpetrated against them is much higher compared to men. But that does not give us as women a ground for abusing this anyway. So a lot of times in my experience, I have seen that, the violence is usually done by the husband, let's say, or by the mother-in-law. There's no point, naming everybody in the family, because it plays havoc with the lives of the people. Second thing, don't do is that a lot of lawyers will suggest you that if you want a high maintenance amount, let's use domestic violence as a technique, right, to create pressure. And I think that's again a blatant abuse of law that should be avoided by women. Thirdly, yes, domestic violence law is comprehensive. Yes, it is wide. But please, it does not mean that the court will, pass an order in your favor absolutely without evidence. Now, here I have to say two quick things. Evidence, evidence, evidence. If you forget everything else I've said today, but you remember one thing, remember, legal fight is all about kagzi fight. It's a paper fight. So before you leave the matrimonial house, you want to collect whatever form of evidence in whatever way you can, so that tomorrow when it comes to it, you will have some evidence to prove it. You can record the conversations, you can, try and film it in any way, but have some evidence. If you want money as maintenance, you need to know how much is your husband earning. If you have absolutely no paper of what he's doing, how much is he earning, no details, it becomes very difficult for lawyers to prove it. And vice versa is also true. That just because you're naming everybody in the domestic incident report, doesn't mean the court is going to order in your favor. So don't use it as a technique. Please only file genuine cases, try and get as much evidence as possible, and report the matter at the earliest opportunity. I think it was Unnati who was pointing out about psychological counseling. The Domestic Violence Act itself says that when the matter goes before the magistrate, if the magistrate thinks it fine, the magistrate is going to send both the parties to court facilitated mediation, which means it's not like you go to the court and the court is necessarily going to pass an order and say, Shadi khatam, domestic violence ho raha hai, right? The court is going to try and make sure that both the parties sit across, talk to each other, so on and so forth. So even if you have acted, rather quickly, doesn't mean that your marriage is going to end. But you need to take an action. You can't suffer in silence.
Right, thank you. So what we've seen now is that there is the legal process, and that needs to start as early as possible. So does emotional counseling, because all of these two sides basically go hand in hand, they go in parallel. And we don't see them as one or the other, but rather both helping a woman make sure that her life is good. And so is the life of those around her, people who are dependent on her. Let me just ask one more question, and then we will switch over to the audience questions. It would seem that counseling is probably a first step or a natural first step that someone should step into. What are some, so how does a victim sort of recognize that now is the time for me to take recourse to counseling? Again, if you can exemplify, give us a couple of stories, Unnati, maybe I'll start with you and then Indu, just a story each. It would be nice, because I think it makes it a little easier to recognize or understand the kind of things that happen.
Right. So what we normally do in the communities, we have a very strong community support. So we have feel like frontline workers who are in the field, and who build a trustworthy rapport with the communities. So whenever a woman is facing violence, since they see their faces every day, they feel like opening up to them. So they do some kind of awareness with the communities, and then once they feel that they have a rapport, they are confident enough to share something which is so intimate to them. That's when they share about their domestic violence or violence, intimate partner violence. And then what we do is we bring that woman to the counseling center. So basically we work two ways. One is the community mobilization, where we mobilize communities towards zero tolerance for violence and respond to their needs and rights. And on the other hand, we have counseling interventions where we will help the woman to empower herself, to negotiate her own space, stand up against violence if it is to occur again, slowly bring about their change in their own behavior, so that they are able to be more confident in standing up against violence and not tolerating it anymore. Right. So yes, so community based, like barefoot counseling, what we used to call, and the I would say the professional counseling help that a woman gets, it helps a woman to seek counseling. But the trust and the rapport initially is very, very important for her to seek, and also for her to understand that yes, my whatever I I'm telling this person it's going to remain confidential. It is not going to be revealed to my husband.
Right. So thank you. That was another question in my mind about how do you go about this whole prevention thing, and fascinating, all that you've talked about. It's about mobilizing the community, not individuals, but a whole community. And
Yeah.
thank you for that. Indu, maybe a very quick story from you about when a person, a lady, steps in and asks for help.
Well, it is extremely difficult for a person to approach a counselor, to first come to a counselor, because the basic problem is they are afraid for their own personal safety and security. They do not know what harm can come to them from the perpetrator, because one of the tactics used by the perpetrator is stalking.
Yeah.
There is that constant fear of every move being watched. And one doesn't know how the perpetrator will take revenge, because the woman is still with the husband. They will reach out for help. I'm answering your basic question of when will she come to us. They will reach out for help only when they feel secure and safe, that there will not be any kind of loss of confidentiality, and that they have physical security. That is when they will come. But sometimes it happens. I would like, since it's a small case that is being presently handled by one of my colleagues, and it's a very typical COVID times case. There is this 60-year-old gentleman who has been confined to his space basically because of Corona. And of late, he has been very interested in a student whom he is guiding through her PhD program. The wife of the house, and he's with her all waking hours of the day. The wife is feeling extremely neglected, but hasn't realized it. She has kept quiet. But the effect that it is having on the housemaids is something tremendous. They have gone to the neighbors and said, Amma is not okay. Amma needs help. Sahib is not talking to her at all. And the neighbors have intervened and have made the lady understand that she needs to go for counseling. And that's how she has come for counseling.
Great.
Just referring to it could be a passing phase. It could be onward.
Amni, couple of questions for you from the audience. One is whether infidelity can be treated as, could also be categorized as domestic abuse. And similarly, does conflict of clash of ideas also result, which could result in emotional abuse? Could that also be treated as domestic violence?
Yeah, Sushila ji, I see that we are short of time. I will try and make some bullet points very quickly. First, on adultery or illicit relationship, that is, I think increasingly the taboo word reason why we've been trying to invoke domestic violence. Now, earlier, adultery was a punishable crime. Only a man could proceed against a man for adultery. So, if my wife is sleeping with somebody, is not my wife, or if I am sleeping with another woman, my wife cannot go to court against me, but I could have gone to the court against the man my wife is sleeping with. Now that is gone. It's no longer a criminal provision. Only thing that remains as far as adultery or illicit relationship in India is concerned is that it's a ground for divorce under Section 13 of Hindu Marriage Act. So if you think that your partner is cheating, no matter how emotionally wrecked you may be, I'm sorry to put it so simply, but seek a divorce. That is the argument. You cannot, on the ground of illicit relationship of the husband, say that because that's caused me so much emotional wreck or havoc, that it is emotional abuse. However, if the husband does not, because he is, let's say, having an affair with somebody else while he is married to you, If he's coming home late, because of that, he's taunting you, because of that, he's not giving you enough money for sustenance, etc., and you still think that there is some hope for marriage, so you have to make out a case based on the emotional abuse caused because of the illicit relationship. The illicit relationship in itself does not become a ground for emotional abuse, no matter what emotions you're having. So let's just be very clear on that. Number two, I've seen women, who in a lot of parts of the country, even where I come from, my hometown in MP, a lot of communities have this practice where men keep keeps. Okay, and keeps is the wrong word. Supreme Court has said it. That's just a practice that continues. Courts have said that even the other woman who is not in a married relationship can approach the court and complain of domestic violence. So that's a second thing to note. The third thing is that under the Indian Evidence Act, there is a law which says that if there is any violence that happens against a woman within the first 7 years of marriage, then the burden of proof is on the husband. I'm making this technical point just to tell you that if your marriage is a fresh one, you have reasons to feel safer, because technically it will be the other side, the husband, who will have to prove that no, it's not a case of domestic violence or harassment against you. So that's another thing to note, and that's also why we say report early, okay, if at all. And one final thing I want to, kind of very quickly add on here is that whatever is your reason for feeling emotionally distraught in a relationship, it can be covered in domestic violence. You got to ask yourself, as a reasonable, objective person, is this violence? Like, I can be sad, I can be angry with my partner or with anybody in my family, but for it to constitute violence, there has to be a third person or reasonable person's test that has to be met. So if you're asking yourself, what is the difference, keep that test in mind. And again, seek the help of a lawyer to understand whether your case fulfills the criteria of domestic violence in particular or not. You can have you can be emotionally distraught, but for it to constitute violence, there has to be a certain more additional threshold that has to be met. Yes, Suchita.
Okay. And one other question, which is, when you have these, some of these, especially sexual harassment cases and so on, that have come into the public eye, and we've seen in the private sector some very senior officials being asked to move on, right? And many private organizations do have a provision of, a committee that looks into sexual harassment, for example, but that's at the workplace. However, in the case of domestic violence, and some of them officers, whether in government or private sector, some of them actually being involved in perpetrating domestic violence, is there a consequence that goes beyond, just giving the woman her divorce or a compensation or whatever? Is there something that happens to the man as well?
Yeah, Sushila ji, that's a very important question, but a layered question. So I'm not sure I can do justice with it in the time I have, but I will try. See, what we saw during the Me Too movement, Sushila ji, is that a lot of women who came after years, of abuse, and they didn't want to go public because, the person in question was a very powerful person. So there were repercussions. Besides, they didn't have any strong evidence. I mean, after years of, being abused, what evidence do you have, right? Which is where media played a very important role, and social media, especially with the Me Too movement. So for women who think that, enough is enough and I need to speak up now, but I don't have any evidences, there is a larger strategy question to be thought of, and social media can play a very important role. That's one point. The second point to your question, are there consequences that men face beyond divorce and compensation? Yes, provided the strategy is right. So there will have to be some kind of a pressure created, some letter writing done to the National Commission of Women. The media will have to be brought in properly. So in India, unfortunately, getting the man punished, so to say, is more than just going to the courts. More will have to be done. There are adequate and more legal provisions, but provisions are one thing. To dust them off and bring them to life is something else. And I think that's again a question of strategy that has to be thought very well. Just one last point. I'm very tempted to say this. When we don't think of children, Induji talked a fair bit about children, but today increasingly the figures are, and these figures are, you can check these figures, 51% of all our boys, okay, minor boys, face sexual violence of one or the other type. And in more than 50% of those cases, it's by somebody we know. So it's happening in the home, it's happening by relatives. So of course there is prevention of sexual harassment against children, but that has a certain limitation clause that will take us to a technical point. But if you have children, not just girls, but also boys, and if you think that there is some kind of a domestic violence happening against them, if not by immediate family members and maybe the relatives of the husband or your own, family relatives, that's something to really keep an eye out for and know that there are more than ample laws which kind of covers this under the prevention of sexual harassment against children. But since we're talking about domestic violence against women, I thought it's very important to talk very quickly about domestic violence that girls and boys also face all the time.
Great, thank you. We have kind of run out of time, so um, just going to summarize a few key points that emerged from this discussion. The first of them being that abuse thrives in silence, and women need to recognize that they are being abused. As Avni said, early enough, start collecting evidence, make sure that you are speaking about it soon enough. And again, the need to look at emotional counseling and legal provisions side by side, rather than looking at them as one or the other or one after another, is again important. For the people around, don't just stand and watch. This is a very, very important issue. We just heard from our panelists the kind of backgrounds in which domestic violence is taking place. And it's very close to us, to every one of us. It's not something that happens to somebody out there. It's something that is happening around us, right where we are. And if we see something happening, there is provision, even in law, for us to do something. There is also the kind of work that is happening in prevention of domestic violence. And even there, it's the community that is taking responsibility and not just an individual. So it is really up to all of us to sort of recognize when something like this is happening and do something about it. There are enough mechanisms that are available today, whether that is in terms of emotional support or in terms of legal support. There are mechanisms available. And it is time that we kind of put this on an important trajectory as part of an agenda that organizations or groups of people need to take up. Let me just finish this or wrap this up by saying that for me, this falls squarely within the Rotary theme of peace and conflict resolution. And that is why I think I'm very glad that these two Rotary clubs have come together to take this issue and highlight it. With that, thank you very much. But I will now hand you over to, I think, President Ravi Nadunadi.
Thank you, everybody. I think I speak on behalf of both the Rotary clubs when I say that this was a much needed subject to be covered. From my perspective, so many points have been raised by the different panelists that one was not aware of, and one has always felt that one is reasonably well informed. We always thought, for example, that this domestic violence was something largely happening in a particular socio-economic background. And what's come out very clearly is that that's not necessarily the case. The definition of what constitutes domestic violence, I think, very helpful. It would have opened the eyes of many people who were here on this call. And I will certainly be propagating the recording of this entire conversation among our members who could not attend for whatever reason, because it does deserve to be discussed in greater detail. Talking about the problem is the first step to finding solutions. So I'm glad to have been a part of this. Individually, the Sridhar project, I think you all have done a signal service by bringing this matter up. Avni, you have covered so many legal points. One did not know the extent of legal protection that's available, not just in terms of the law, but even in terms of financial assistance to victims. So those are very good and very strong points. Of course, I think all Indians in particular have this fear that going to the law means losing a significant number of years of their life. But there again, you have pointed out that there are shortcuts that the law has provided. Indu brought about the whole psychological angle, and what really I have carried away is that very often the victim feels responsible for the violence. The victim feels that he or she is the cause why the perpetrator is being violent. And that's again a very important point for people to bear in mind, not to take on guilt, but to analyze the whole situation in the cold light of reason and then take appropriate steps. From Unnati, I took away a sense of hope when she said that in her practice and in her experience, there have been a number of people who, even if the whole violence was not eliminated, there was a significant or at least some improvement in the situation. And that is definitely something that we must all strive for and do everything that's possible to insulate the vulnerable, whether they're women, whether they're children. By the way, I recently read a newspaper article, I don't remember which publication, which says that India is the country with the third largest number of husband abuse in the world. So that may well be the subject of another seminar that we will hold. But these are very important, relevant points. Thank you, everybody, for having spared your time to educate us. Sushila, you have asked very insightful questions that opened up the subject. Namrata, you made the effort to get both the Rotary clubs to get involved. And of course, the tech team has been very helpful. Without them, we would not have been able to do this. Shobha, in particular, from the Midtown office, Aishwarya in the background. So I thank everybody, thank all the participants, the guests, for having shared their time. We have, I believe, recorded this thing, and if anybody wants it, we will make this recording available. It does deserve to be propagated. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So I just wish to say thank you to everyone for the invitation and for having us here. Thank you very much. It's a very important discussion or topic that we've brought about in the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Unnati. Thank you, Avni. Thank you, Indu. And of course, Sushila, you rocked it. Thanks a ton, everyone. It's been fabulous. And yes, like our President Ravi said, that there's room for many more conversations. And I think we should take it on seriously.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Wonderful program, Namrata.
Yes,
Thank you, President Ravi.
Thank you, Ravi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yep. Bye, everybody.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.